Everybody, a very warm welcome to all of you who have joined in the webinar already, and we expect many more people to join in the next few minutes. So while I start with the initial introductions and formalities, we'll give our attendees just a couple of more minutes to do that. So once again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are and joining in to this conference. We are going to this is the third town hall meeting that we're doing with David, and the format will remain same. I see that a number of you who've joined have attended our previous town halls as well. So basically, this time what we will do is we will answer a number of questions that are commonly asked based on the team's experience that are implementing Kanban or Kanban tools, and we'll take up those questions first. And once we've gone through those questions, and hopefully many of those questions will resonate with you, we will then go on to audience questions. And so we hope to be able to cover all of the questions, the standard questions as well as the audience questions in good time. This time we are doing this town hall meeting for at least 90 minutes, and if needed, maybe we could go a little longer. But we want to make sure that we give enough time to everyone to get their questions answered. Once again, just a few housekeeping points. So if you can have your questions ready and typed up in the Q&A box, which should typically be on the bottom right of your screens. If you can have that ready, we will read out the questions and make sure that everyone can hear those questions. Number one. Number two, on the bottom left, you will see several icons, and one of them will allow you to move into full screen mode when you're ready to do that. And so let me just get started with the agenda for the webinar today. We'll start with some introductions to those of you who have not yet met David. We'll give you a very quick introduction to Digite and Swift-Kanban, and then we'll get on with the actual questions, and both the standard as well as the audience questions, and then finally wrap up. So let me go ahead and first of all provide an introduction to today's speaker, David Anderson, President of David J. Anderson Associates. And again, I do this introduction each time, realizing fully well that perhaps majority of you know him very well already. But for those who may not know David, David Anderson is a thought leader and a pioneer in the field of lean Kanban for software development and managing effective software teams. He's over 25 years experience in the software industry, starting with computer games in the early 1980s. He's led software teams delivering great productivity and quality using innovative agile methods. David has written 2 books, Agile Management for Software Engineering, Applying Theory of Constraints for Business Results, and Kanban, Successful Evolutionary Change for Your Technology Business. David is the founder of the Lean Software and Systems Consortium, a not-for-profit organization dedicated to promoting greater professionalism and better economic outcomes in our industry. And of course, David is the president CEO of DJ Anderson Associates, who provide consulting, coaching, and training services to organizations that are adopting Kanban and lean methods of software development, DevOps, and IT operations, besides other business functions. And last but not the least, we are very fortunate to have David as an advisor to Digite, and he consults with us for overall product strategy, especially in the area of lean Kanban. So, David, a very warm welcome to you. Hopefully you can hear me well.
Hi, good morning.
Good afternoon,
evening for whoever's listening. I'm sorry, I'm still on mute.
That's okay. And I'm your host. My name is Mahesh Singh. I'm co-founder and senior vice president of product at Digite, and I'll be your moderator today, making sure that we get as many questions into the panel discussion today, and or rather in the webinar today, and get them answered. So just a quick introduction about Digite to those of you who may not be familiar with what we do. Digite is a pioneer in web-based collaborative products and solutions for geographically distributed teams. So our focus has been largely to facilitate collaboration amongst distributed teams and allow them to work smoothly from a software development project management perspective. We are headquartered in Mountain View, California, with over 250,000 users across the world, especially concentrated around the Americas, Europe, and Asia Pacific. We have products that cover Lean Kanban, Agile ALM, Application Lifecycle Management, and Project Portfolio Management areas. Swift-Kanban is our flagship Lean Kanban product that we have launched recently, and we're getting great reviews from our trial users, from our initial customers, and from our prospective pilot customers as well. We were named. We've been a player in the application lifecycle management space for quite some time. And last year, when Gartner started to publish the market scope report for ALM, Digite was one of the vendors featured in that report as well. So we have got a lot of history in application lifecycle management and in project management space. We have a lot of experience working with a variety of customers around the world, and we bring to our customers and to our prospects a very rich sort of history and experience of implementing solutions, implementing processes, and enabling distributed teams to work much more effectively. Just a quick look at some of our customers. We obviously sell to a variety of customers, whether they are corporate customers like a T-Mobile or an Aviva or a MetLife or a Northern Trust. We have IT services companies, large consulting and services companies that have distributed teams that are working with their clients and making them more effective in the way that they are able to interact with their customers and with their partners, as well as a variety of other technology companies that use our products and services. So just a quick introduction to Digite, and now again back to the webinar, and just a quick pointer to how you might be able to ask questions. So all of you who have logged in, I see many more people have joined in the last few minutes. A warm welcome to everyone, and again just to point you to the various areas of the screen that you might see. On the bottom right, you see the Q&A box. Please use that for asking questions. And on the bottom left, you see some icons that will help you move into full screen mode, so that you can view the slides better, and you are able to see the content or see the topic that is being discussed well at any point in time. So with that, David, let me start with some of the questions that as we have spoken a number of times in the past, we have interactions going on with a large number of companies that are doing and teams that are doing agile in one way or the other, and are looking at Kanban or are implementing Kanban and are looking at tools, etc. And we see a standard set of questions emerge from there, which show that there is scope for educating both from a pure Kanban and lean software development perspective, besides of course dealing with tool issues and so on. So let me start with some typical questions that we see coming up, and the first one here that you can see on the screen is, what are some of the common best practices to determine WIP limits in a Kanban system? So one of the questions that while most people are able to define a flow fairly easily, and of course depending on how complex the flow is, it can get a little hairy, but most people have questions on how do you define WIP limits? Is it simply a capacity issue, or are there other factors to be considered? And of course one of the questions that we get asked is it okay for WIP limits to change as teams start to work with the Kanban system?
Okay, thank you. So once again, we start the town hall meeting with what seems like a simple question, but it's actually got a lot of nuance to it that requires a thorough answer. One of the basic principles is you start with what you do now. So one very simple way to set the WIP limit is simply to count the amount of work in progress you have in progress currently, and establish that number as the initial limit. That's probably the least impactful way of getting started. It's important to realize that every time you change a WIP limit, you are changing the process definition. In lean language, it's a little Kaizen event when you change a WIP limit. So these things can have implications. the next level of guidance might be choose a WIP limit that reflects the level of, I don't particularly like the term multitasking, but the level of work per person or per person in a particular work function. So you might, for example, say that we read some research that said that people will be most effective when they're working on two different things simultaneously, and therefore we want our WIP limit to be 2 items per person. And if you happen to have 10 software developers, well, that would imply a limit of 20. However, it's usually not just quite that simple, because you might want to consider blocking work and impediments, to use an agile language, things that represent external variation that may be outside of your control. And you might want to take a look at what's a typical level for that recently, or how many do we have right now, and add that to the limit. So your policy might be, we have 2 things per person plus a maximum of 4 blockers. And it's quite important to recognize that you should establish a policy for a WIP limit rather than a number itself, because the policy will be a lot more long-lived than the number might be. There's a thread running currently on the Kanban Dev Yahoo group where someone posted a question saying, what should we do when someone goes on vacation? Well, if you had a policy that said that the WIP limit is established based on the number of people, perhaps 2 items per person, and someone goes on a 2-week vacation, it would be reasonable to lower the WIP limit by 2 during that period. And while the number will have changed in the system, the policy hasn't changed. So if you get beyond the just count the number of items you have now and start with that, the next level would be establish a policy based on the amount of multitasking or collaborative working that you desire. It is, for example, acceptable to set a WIP limit which is smaller than the number of people you have. Say, for example, you have a team of expert extreme programmers who are always pair programming, then it would make sense to have a policy something like, we want 1 user story per pair of programmers plus a maximum of 3 blocking stories. And if you had 10 programmers, then that would imply the WIP limit is 5 plus 3, which is 8. But you would express the WIP limit as a policy rather than a specific number. Of course, you put numbers on the board and you put numbers in the tool, but you should have policies for determining the number. Your sub-question here, Mahesh, says, is it simply capacity? I think we need to be careful how we use this word capacity. We do tend to use it in relation to ourselves as individuals. We'll casually remark that, oh, I don't have capacity for that. And typically what we mean is that we can't allocate the time to do some additional piece of work. Right. So we need to be careful how we're using it, because I feel that that's not a particularly useful usage of the word capacity, and it leans us towards the idea that we're managing people rather than managing the work. And I think it's very important that we should focus on managing the work and let the people figure out on their own how to achieve the required results. That's really the big paradigm shift that we're making, not just with Kanban, but with the Agile and Lean movement generally. We're moving away from the 20th century idea that we manage people. We're focusing on managing the work and achieving mutually desirable outcomes for customers, for investors, other stakeholders, perhaps regulators, and of course the workforce themselves. So manage the work, not the people. And if you think about capacity as something related to people, that's the wrong mindset or paradigm. Really, capacity here is the WIP limit itself. If the total work in progress limit in the system was, say, 25, then what you're saying is we have capacity for 25 work items, user stories or use cases, whatever you might be calling them. The next question here is, what other factors should be considered in determining WIP limits? Well, every time you change a WIP limit or establish one in the first place, you are potentially introducing a change in the organization that may meet with resistance. So you need to consider that. The start with what you do now principle would suggest that you set the WIP limit at the current level and hope that that will reduce over time. If you create a policy and introduce that, that policy needs to be aligned with what's acceptable to the workers. Otherwise they will resist, so that's clearly a determining factor. And you may want to consider things like the amount of collaborative working that you wish to achieve, or the effective utilization that you might want to achieve through some minimal multitasking, such as assigning 2 items per person. In addition to that, of course, there's the more traditional lean manufacturing way of thinking about it using Little's law, and that when you change the WIP limit, you will have an effect on both the lead time through the system and the rate of delivery, the throughput from the system. And those things may be concerns. You may want to hit a specific goal. For example, you're planning a long-term project. You need to achieve a particular velocity of throughput rate in order to complete that project. And you want to set a WIP limit that will allow you to achieve that. Now, explaining the detail of that mathematics is really not feasible in this forum, this voice radio style format, but I will be talking about that type of calculation in my advanced Kanban book, and I've been actually presenting that material. Recently I did the evening in Belmont in California with you guys recently, and then more recently my keynote speech at Agile Cambridge, and my keynote speech next week at Lean Kanban Central Europe in Munich.
Right.
I'll be talking about how you use Little's law for planning major projects. The final question here is it okay for WIP limits to change often? And I think this is, again, another important question. When you first introduce your Kanban system design, it is very likely that it will need adjusting, and that's a natural thing. It's also likely that the introduction of Kanban will provoke a number of minor changes very rapidly, and that in turn will require adjustments to the WIP limit. But it's important to realize that adjusting the WIP limit is a system change, and therefore if you're doing it too often, you're risking what Edward Deming referred to as tampering. So once your system has matured a little bit and settled down, and you've been doing Kanban for a while, and a while might be 2, 3, 4 months, perhaps as much as 6 months. If you've reached that point and you find that you're often changing the WIP limit, you're almost certainly tampering. And it's really important to be able to separate out the common versus special cause variation, or I used the original Schuhart terms in my book, the chance cause variation versus the assignable cause variation. And you really shouldn't be changing WIP limits in response to chance cause variation unless you have wrongly defined a WIP limit and you feel that you need to change it to make it larger or smaller. But that should happen very seldom. The changing a WIP limit, or more accurately, overriding a WIP limit in response to an assignable cause variation, some sort of external blocker, for example, that's very acceptable. But recognize that what you're doing is overriding the policy rather than changing the policy. And making override decisions is something that perhaps an immediate team lead or function manager should have the authority to do, and they should be able to do it intentionally. And it would make sense, particularly for more regulated environments, to actually record the decision and to record the reason why the WIP limit policy was overridden.
Right.
So
one of the sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
I just wanted to state that I think that covers the question. So I'm finished talking.
So one of the interesting things that I heard someone say about the changing of WIP limits was that they said that as the flow becomes smooth and as the system's throughput starts to improve, and the ability to increase WIP limits without changing actual number of resources, etc., should that indicate that the Kanban system is working well? So the fact that you've been able to smooth out the flow, take out bottlenecks, etc., and therefore are able to deliver more, and that potentially allows you to increase WIP limits. Should you do that, and is that almost like a metric for showing that the system is working well?
It's always dangerous to talk about metrics. I would think it's more likely to be the opposite, that when the system is working well, it enables you to reduce the WIP limits, and typically that would be an indicator that the organization is really improving. The reasoning being that an improved organization should suffer from fewer assignable cause variations because they've matured their capability at root cause analysis and taking action to prevent those problems. They've improved their communication lines with external groups. They've improved their ability to escalate problems, and they've improved their risk management capability, so that they're ahead of the game and they're preventing assignable cause variations before they happen. In addition to that, we would expect a reduction in the common cause variation. And certainly not to the levels that you would see in a manufacturing operation, but we would expect to see some reduction in common cause variation as the organization improves. It could be something as simple as they've instituted a pair programming regime where they swap pairs regularly, and the result is that all the programmers on the team learn each other's techniques, and they learn the code base in a broad sense, and as a result the performance of any one individual at writing code becomes less of a factor. It's harder to see the difference in the capability of individuals as they become more of a somewhat homogeneous team in terms of their understanding of the code base and the coding capability. So, yeah, we would expect the WIP limit to reduce over time rather than increase as an indicator of improvement.
Excellent, excellent. One other thing that we have got continuous sort of questioning on is the exact role of prioritization. How do you ensure that when you are pulling work into your queue, that it is the topmost priority at that point in time? So the next question is really related to that. That how important is the role of prioritization in Kanban? What other factors might be considered when pulling work? And obviously, cost of delay is one common method of considering what work to be taken up next. But what are so the typical other factors considered in defining priority? David, before you answer, let me just share some feedback that some people are having trouble hearing you. If you could perhaps speak into the microphone a little more, that might help.
Perhaps it's as simple as increasing the volume level that's being recorded.
There you go.
Hopefully that's better.
Okay.
I noticed that the software is reducing the level automatically.
Yes, it does do some automatic adjustment.
Yeah, in fact, it's still doing it. So
that's okay. I can certainly hear you better now. So
okay, I'm not speaking loudly, but I noticed that it's gradually reducing the level to prevent perhaps distortion.
Right.
So I will try and keep an eye on it. Okay, prioritization. I am not a fan of this word, and I'm not a fan of the noun that goes with it, which is priority. So I've been stripping out and hopefully it's already gone, the use of the words prioritization and priority from both the book and all our training materials. When we select a work item to go into the input queue, we talk about that as queue replenishment and selection rather than prioritization. And then once items are within the system, they're on the Kanban board, once again, as they're moved across that board, they're pulled across, and the people doing the pulling are selecting the item from potentially several choices. So it really becomes a question of how does something get selected, and while you might describe that as some form of priority or prioritization, it's done dynamically at that very moment. It's not planned in advance. And I feel these priority as a noun and as typically a variable that's set on an item in its data record, and prioritization is the act of determining priority. These are really legacy terms, they're 20th century terms, and they refer to the idea that we plan things in advance and that somehow we have knowledge of the future that enables us to do that. What we're realizing is that often our assumptions about the future are not as good as we thought they were, and deferring a decision until as late as possible is advantageous. So when we decide to pull something into our input queue in the Kanban system, at that point we're committing to delivering it. So the mindset or paradigm that's much more appropriate is to think about the backlog or the items available for pulling into our system as a set of options. And at the point where we decide to replenish the queue with a particular item, we are committing to convert that option into something real. So the queue replenishment action is the commitment point. It's the point of deciding to convert the option And then the process through our system is the process of converting it until it's ready for delivery, at which point it's real, it's deliverable, it's no longer an option. So the question really shouldn't be how do we do prioritization or priority. Priority is a proxy variable that we want to eliminate, and prioritization is a planning activity that pretends that we understand the future. The question ought to be, how do we select something? What are the criteria used for selection when we pull something into the input queue, or when we choose to pull something across the board from one stage to another? And that how is very contextual. The current book uses cost of delay, and that's very appropriate for items that can be delivered individually or in very small batches, and in a circumstance where we make frequent delivery. We deliver on demand for an individual item, or we're delivering daily or weekly, perhaps as seldom as every 2 or 3 weeks. In that circumstance, cost of delay is a very useful parameter within the risk profile for the work that we're doing. It may not always be the best choice, but it's commonly a very good choice. But there may be other circumstances. Say, for example, we are doing a 2-year-long legacy system replacement project, and therefore our backlog may be several thousand items that represent the current existing functionality of the legacy system. And while we could debate the stakeholder requirements, it's all too common to find that such legacy system replacements come with a requirement for parity functionality with the legacy system. In other words, the new system must do at least everything the old system did, plus perhaps some extra things. And no one stops to ask the question whether all of those things are even useful. But it's common to see parity functionality. So let's imagine you have 2,000 of those, and you have to get them done over a couple of years. Well, you might ask yourself, which one should we pick?
Right.
To start now, to start this week and next week, how would our decision change? Well, the key to this, and this will be explained in the Advanced Kanban book, is to be able to risk profile the work, to determine the number of dimensions of risk that we have to manage, and then to essentially prioritize those dimensions, where cost of delay is just one dimension, and in a legacy system replacement, it's not an appropriate dimension typically. So we might look at things like technical risk, for example, and we may decide that we're going to prioritize high technical risk over lower technical risk. So we might make some policy that says a certain percentage of the work we're doing early in the life cycle of the project should be items of high technical risk, and we may choose to color the tickets to indicate that, and perhaps to set some WIP limit within the system for items of high technical risk. And those things will then inform our pull decision, because we may have one slot free this week for a high technical risk item, which would then prompt the question, how many items remaining in the backlog are classified as high technical risk? And then we might look through those and use some secondary criteria like particular skill set, or which component within the system or which subsystem does the requirement affect, and use that to inform an on-the-spot decision for queue replenishment.
Right. Right. So cost of delay, technical risk, as I imagine there could be other types of risk that might also be evaluated as part of deciding which item should be taken up for work next. One of the other things that we a lot of our customers tend to be IT services companies, and they're doing application development work for their clients, and sometimes a simple thing for them to do is to simply ask the customer which is the next in priority, but many times they are forced to educate their customer on which items should be taken up next, and I think these factors would come in useful to be able to let the customer know that what they might consider priority may not really be the right item to take, and they should consider some others.
I actually feel that removing the whole activity of prioritization is immensely useful, because the prioritization activity and the priority that comes out of that activity disconnects the business and the risks the business is managing from the IT workers, the developers, analysts, testers, and so on. And it masks a lot of useful information that can inform better quality decision making during the development project itself. I also think that it can be terribly frustrating for business people because they're being asked to translate a multi-dimensional risk problem that they're managing that carries a great deal of uncertainty. For example, questions like how much money will this feature make us in the future?
Right.
And that's typically a question they can't answer. So they're dealing with this multi-dimensional problem with a high range of variability on several of the dimensions, and they're being asked to translate that into some simple formula like high, medium, or low, or 1, 2, or 3, or even worse, is the idea that we stack rank the items, so that if you have 400 items on your backlog, we have some meeting where we discuss these different dimensions and the relative importance of them, and we somehow risk adjust them based on the uncertainty that we perceive around them, and then we come out with some very neat stack ranking that tells us the order. And if we had that same meeting a week later, you would get a different order because we have new information. And in many cases, choosing between one thing or another is very difficult because there is uncertainty in the information and the results would overlap with each other. So I think business people find it very frustrating, and the results, being forced into prioritizing things and then to watch as those things are delivered based on that priority, often where it's become patently obvious that things are being done in the wrong sequence or an inappropriate sequence, that's frustrating. And simply taking that activity away and using language that the business is comfortable with, using terms that they use, and designing that into our Kanban system through the use of colors or swim lanes, and indicating to them that different types of work with different risks associated with them are clearly visible within the system, that's much more effective, and it connects the IT workers with the business people much more directly. It leads to a much more fruitful and high quality conversation.
Excellent, excellent. So then now that the work has been selected and it is on the board, one of the common challenges that engineering teams are dealing with is this whole issue of handling rework. So we've had some very interesting conversations in the last few weeks about just the ability to identify what is regular work versus rework, because as as somebody said to us, accurately measuring rework is critical for us to determine the cost of quality in my organization. How do we track rework in a Kanban board? So, have you seen this question come up, and what are some of the practices around that? Some design options that we went through was where to perhaps move a card that has been identified for rework, and flag it as rework and simply move it back in the existing value stream or existing lane. Another option that has been discussed is to have a separate swim lane with the same exact value stream, but have that swim lane identified for just rework items. And of course, the sort of recommended practice is that you introduce early feedback steps throughout the value stream so that you don't really have rework. You basically identify issues that might be there much earlier and keep fixing them on a continuous basis. What are your thoughts there, David?
So this comes up in every single class that we teach, and probably at least 50% of every speaking engagement that I or one of my team give publicly. And it's clearly a very important topic. The answer to your question is that all the choices that you've made available here are all correct, and that many more options are also correct.
Okay.
The reality is that the way that you want to handle rework is the way that you want to handle it, and it's entirely contextual to your situation, the dynamics of your organization, politically and culturally, as well as the nature of the work itself. Each of these three options you put here are choices, and many other choices are possible, and every choice has consequences, and some choices will be better matched to your organization than others. I think often people are asking for what's the best way to do it. I understand why people want that. They want to be able to point at some foundational material on which they can anchor their decision of choice. But the reality is that you need to study your own situation carefully and decide what's an appropriate choice. The dynamics are different. For example, you could choose, if you discover something needs rework, you could choose to leave it where it is on the board and leave it to count against the WIP limit, even if people from a different function need to come and work on it. The ticket stays in situation, and perhaps it causes idleness. And you may not like that. You may decide that that's too painful and it causes too many political implications. On the other hand, you may embrace that idea that leaving an item that requires rework in situation causes idleness, and that provokes a conversation to say, how could we stop this from happening in the future, and how might we change our process to reduce the amount of rework? You may prefer that. On the other hand, if you feel that that's going to be too provocative, you might decide to do like the first option here, move the card back. And if you have this requirement to be able to measure rework, because there's a legacy requirement to measure the cost of quality, I have to refer to this as legacy, because anything with the word cost in it is a 20th century problem. But I respect the fact that there are organizations out there where they have to measure this. So you want to understand how much is rework so that you can calculate some cost of quality. Perhaps a more modern term for that might be failure demand. And you're identifying, therefore, how much of the work you're doing is essentially non-value adding. A simple way to do it might be to change the color of the ticket when you move it backwards.
Right.
A digital system could record date stamps to indicate that something was moved backwards for rework and provide reports on that without necessarily changing the color. Changing the color is quite a powerful way of doing it, though it would be a very strong emotional motivator to indicate the quantity of rework as a percentage of the total. I'll have a separate swim lane for rework. We've certainly seen that. That is a design that is relatively common. That's another way of visualizing it. If you prefer not to change the color, perhaps you have a separate swim lane. We've also seen people put WIP limits on that swim lane to say that they're only willing to take a certain percentage of their total capacity as rework. And if there's other rework queuing, then that will cause the rest of the system to stall and will cause idleness that might then provoke a conversation on how do we reduce the quantity of rework. And that's slightly a softer choice than just stopping it immediately. If we were coaching this with a client, we'd be looking very carefully at the organizational maturity.
Right.
To decide which of the options was more appropriate. And this type of discussion is something that I'll be elaborating on a lot more in the Advanced Kanban book. The introduce early feedback steps throughout the value stream, that's really the definition of done, or the exit criteria of policies that determine whether something can be pulled into the next stage. And I think very much that higher maturity organizations and high capability organizations are good at having very tight definitions of done. You could imagine a very professional extreme programming shop having a very tight definition of done that prevents poor quality leaking down through their workflow, and therefore they experience very low rework. It could be a much more traditional SDLC type shop, and they simply have a strong exit criteria level designed to reduce rework. The caution I would have there is to recognize that the higher the exit criteria, often the longer the lead time will be. That there's a core message underlying the Agile movement, which says that you make progress with imperfect information. The whole idea that you refactor code because that's actually faster and cheaper, rather than delaying in order to acquire perfect analysis before you get started. If you had a very high exit criteria policy on your analysis activity for writing your requirements, so in an Agile world that would be user stories. If the bar to that was very high, that would cause delay. And while it might reduce rework later on, it would increase the overall lead time and may incur things like cost of delay. There might be lost opportunity. The great thing about Kanban, a Kanban system, and the metrics that tools like Swift-Kanban are collecting is that it will enable businesses to study those effects and to make appropriate choices about whether to focus on reducing cost of quality or whether to look at increasing the value delivered by avoiding opportunity cost of delay. These things could be direct trade-offs.
Right, right. In fact, what you just said about the need for greater documentation at the time of defining the user story, and therefore perhaps missing a market opportunity versus doing it and therefore having a smoother time during the development phase. That's a very common situation that we ourselves deal with in Digite all the time, because between product management and engineering there is there is some debate about how much detail should be available at the initial stages of the user story versus the predictability of how soon that user story might get delivered. So you're right. There are trade-off questions that we deal with all the time. I like the term that you used just now, failure demand, instead of saying rework. I'm certainly going to try and use that in our discussions with customers. So one question that comes up, and you referred to metrics just now. One question that perhaps is more theoretical at this point, and I think teams, as they start to work with this, will come up with their own conclusions about the policy here. But if I have a user story which was in my regular lane for work, and then gets switched over to a separate swim lane which is marked for rework. From a tool perspective, what happens to the lead time, cycle time calculation for that user story? Because obviously now it is in a different lane, and therefore cycle time essentially gets reset. Is that sort of conceptually okay to treat them as two different user stories in one sense?
I'm not particularly happy with that.
Right, exactly, because you do want to see the overall impact of. Or rather, you want to see the overall cycle time to take one story from start to end, including any rework that might have been done on it, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So having a separate swim lane, it tends to beat that particular objective. Okay, great. So let me go on to the next question, and there are a number of audience questions coming in as well. So I want to try and see how we can get those in as well. Again, another issue that gets discussed both within Digite, and we've seen this come from a number of customers, is, and I think this happens a lot with teams that are moving in from maybe a Scrum-based approach, where there is a clear visibility, or at least there is an attempt for a clear visibility on when the next release is coming in and what is the scope of this release. What is the role of estimation in Kanban? And is it desirable to be doing estimation at individual card level to be able to predict when that card might get done and how much effort it might take to do?
Okay, so this is the big common question, or something that comes up a lot. A lot of early Kanban examples, the estimation activity was dropped, and there was no use of estimates and no individual delivery dates or commitments made on any tickets. It's important to realize that those decisions were contextual and situationally specific. In other words, they represented instances of Kanban system designs and not particular guidance on a prescriptive method. Whether to do estimation or not is something that each individual group or project or team need to decide for themselves. However, the use of a Kanban system provides you with some alternatives that are worth considering. Before we even get there though, the bigger question is, what do your customers want?
Mm-hmm.
And one common dysfunction I find in larger companies is that IT organizations and product development organizations spend their time trying to satisfy middle managers in intermediary functions within the company. So why do I need to make an estimate for this? Because some guy makes a plan, and on the plan, in his Gantt chart somewhere, he needs to indicate how long it's going to take. And why do I need to make a delivery date commitment? Perhaps for the same reason, or perhaps because some other manager, perhaps a director of the PMO, feels that unless people are making commitments on individual things, they won't be professional enough and capable enough of delivering anything. And we have to recognize these things as corporate dysfunctions, that there is really no basis for these biases to be held. And we need to look at what will satisfy customers. It's very common for us when we're working with organizations and we do an initial demand and capability analysis to realize that many of the things which are causing customers to be dissatisfied are being introduced as sources of variability and dissatisfaction by intermediary functions, and often middle managers and intermediary functions within the organization. And simply stripping those away frees up the team to deliver in a way that satisfies customers better. So to decide whether or not you would make an estimate, you need to ask yourself, what does the customer want? And could we try offering the customer a different offer? And this is described in my current book, the idea that you go to the customer and you say, how about we deliver new code to you working every 2 weeks on a regular schedule, and that we give you complete transparency on what we're doing, and that we record the time it takes from when we commit to start something to when we deliver it, and we report to you the average and the typical spread on those lead times. And we give you a confidence interval that if you pick something to start this week, it will be delivered in, say, for example, 6 weeks from now with 85% confidence. And therefore, the likelihood is that if it slips by a couple of weeks, we'd be even more confident of making it. But we'll guarantee that you get a delivery of something working every 2 weeks, and that those things being delivered will typically have been committed to within the previous 4 to 6 weeks. It may be that the customer actually really goes for that.
Mm-hmm.
The resistance that you get from inside your organization is defensiveness from people whose job it is to perform the planning, prioritization, tracking, and reporting in a different way. So it's important to recognize that this has got the resistance really has little to do with customer resistance, it's internal resistance. Now, if that internal resistance is something that you can't deal with in the short term, then you're stuck in a world where you have to continue performing estimation. And it's likely that while you'll go through the ritual of estimating things, you'll record the data, and that data will go on the tickets. It could be that you will never use that information ever again. In the same way that I see teams where, from a legacy perspective, they still do prioritization, and they stick a priority on the Kanban ticket, and it sits there like a little ornament in the top right-hand corner of a ticket, with a blob, with a dot, with the priority written in it. And it's there as a decoration because they never use that information ever again. And that's fine, because if you visualize that for long enough, you'll get to a point where people will say, you know, we spend quite a few hours coming up with these numbers, and we're actually not using them for anything whatsoever. Perhaps it's time to stop doing them. You know, so how can we best determine and communicate the size of work and the likely completion date of the card? You have to study the historical work. The term that I use in most of my presentations is the natural philosophy of your universe. And a Kanban tool like Swift-Kanban produces that data, produces the cumulative flow diagrams and the control charts to help you study the work that you've done historically, and to give you the tools to analyze that statistically and to make inferences based on the historical past. Then is it possible or desirable to do this for all the cards in the ready queue and predict when the next release will be? there seems to be an assumption built into that question that a release should be triggered by a certain level of functionality,
right,
rather than a date in the calendar. And that's a perfectly valid situation. It tends to be less common, the idea that something has a calendar date and then you do your best to put as much functionality in as you can by the date. That concept seems to be more common, perhaps 80%, whereas the situation of something must be functionality triggered does seem to be a lot less common, maybe 20% of what I observed, but it's still a valid problem. So the issue would be, how long will it take us to get the required functionality done? And the information you need to make a statistical estimate of that is in your cumulative flow diagram and in your control chart data. Your cumulative flow diagram will show you the average throughput, and it will show you some spread of variation, and so will the control chart data. And you can use that information to calculate with a confidence level a delivery date based on the quantity of work, assuming no further process changes, assuming that you continue to break work down and analyze it in the way that you've been doing, and that you continue to follow your development and testing process as you've been doing, and that any future change would only cause a positive improvement rather than a negative. And you can use that to make planning, and this sort of long-term planning and using statistical data. Again, this is material that I'm covering in my keynote speech in Munich next week, and material that will be in the Advanced Kanban book when it's published.
The second point, I think we've seen come more often from our customers who are themselves ISVs and are building products and trying to figure out the best ways for release planning and so on. We've also seen that question come up from our own prospects or customers who want to know, what's our roadmap, what's the next releases planned, and what is going to come in each of them, and that's where these discussions need to take place in order to give a general guidance to customers that these are all the things that we're working on, and that as soon as possible we will deliver to them functionality that they are that is perhaps important to them. So
yeah, I think it is. These questions are often rooted in the idea that Kanban is a replacement software development process for what we're doing now, and of course it isn't. Adding a Kanban system to their existing development process is what the Kanban method's all about, and that in turn may provide them with additional insight and additional data and metrics that might be useful, and may enable them to have alternatives for how they do planning, estimation, make commitments, and so forth. But the very flippant but entirely accurate response to how do we do estimation and planning in Kanban is, how are you doing it now? Because if the core principle is that you start with what you're doing now, then how you do estimation and planning is how you're doing it now.
Right, exactly. Great. So good. I mean, excellent points that you made, David. And I think these are some of the most common sort of basic operations or design questions that we see come up from our clients, and also we've seen that internally as well as from our customers. So very, very helpful from that point of view. There are a few that are sort of more high level or more advanced questions that get asked every now and then. But before I do that, though, I wanted to try and take up a couple of audience questions as well, and I'm going to try and paste it on the whiteboard here. And if I have trouble doing that, I might just put it on your Skype chat. So the question that is being asked, and as I speak it, I will also try and put it in here. The question that was asked is that in your first book you had spoken a little bit about risk profile, so while we wait for the advanced Kanban book, can you recommend some reading material for risk profile? And this is from Terry Ebo, I guess I'm pronouncing the name correctly, and he says that I'm fairly new to Kanban, 8 months practice. So they basically want to know any recommended readings for risk profiling or risk profile.
So the risk profiling stuff, unfortunately, in terms of Kanban, not particularly widely documented. Some of my own people at Mike Burrows are talking about it more publicly. But to give you an idea of at least the general direction, I actually like Barry Bain and Richard Turner's Balancing Discipline and Agility book, because it's really the only book on Agile that demonstrates multi-dimensional risk profiling using something called caveat charts, sometimes referred to as spider web diagrams, where each one of the dimensions on those charts is a dimension of risk. So for example, with Kanban we talk about cost of delay, and perhaps we qualitatively evaluate cost of delay using market payoff function shapes or cost of delay function shapes, and then classify that qualitative evaluation, we classify it into things like an expedite class of service or a fixed date, standard class, and so on. Well, you can imagine that each one of those is a notch on a single leg of a caveat diagram, and there may be other legs on there with other notches. I have published a number of other schemes for classifying work into typically between 4 and 6 categories. There's the market risk of change scheme that is really catching on, becoming a lot more popular, where we classify things into table stakes, cost reducers, spoilers, and differentiators. And recently I've added a couple of variants to that, where there's regulatory requirements which are similar to table stakes, but exhibit a slightly different risk profile. And then there's something I call misdirectors, which are differentiators that are not aligned with the company's strategic plan, and are often there to misdirect or distract the public away from some other perhaps strategic issue that the business has. So that would be a second scheme, and if you were looking to risk profile in multiple dimensions, you might qualitatively assess cost of delay. You might qualitatively assess the market risk of change. You might look at, for example, technical risk in an item, and that might become a dimension. And what will come out from that is a caveat chart with multiple dimensions and a shape that looks like a spider has woven it on the web. And what I'm expecting is that we will gradually develop a number of patterns based on those shapes that will provide good guidance. We'll have to be careful that we don't use the term best practice, but good guidance on potential Kanban system designs based on those shapes. And I think that that's a significant area of growth intellectually for the Kanban community over the next 2 or 3 years.
Right, right. Okay, just wanted to share a comment that came in from Andrew Fuqua. And I think it is in reference to the discussion that we had earlier about estimation. It says, right, my client wants to not undertake certain epics if it's going to cost more than say $500,000. They simply don't want to start it. So that's why they do estimation. And obviously,
I found the Agile community has degenerated into referring to any analysis activity as estimation, and I suspect that this is tribal in the sense that analysis tools from the 1990s are labeled in that processing tools enemy of the Agile tribe category. And to me, estimation means time spent on something and amount of money to be spent on it. And while certainly you could sit down with an epic and you could try and figure that out, my guess is that what most people do with epics is that they analyze them to break them down into smaller stories. And once you've done that exercise, you could simply use the historical data on how long does it take us to complete a story, what's our throughput rate, what's our WIP limit, and you can deduce from that if your throughput is 1,000 stories per year and it costs you $1 million to run your development department, then it's costing you so I forgot the numbers there, 1,000 stories and $1 million. So it's costing you about $1,000 per story. So if you've broken your epic down into 45 stories, you can say this is an approximately $45,000 epic, and you don't actually need to try and estimate it individually. You can simply use the breakdown activity, and that breakdown activity is an analysis activity, and the tendency recently to call it estimation, it is, in my opinion, just a tribal language way of making it acceptable, because the Agile tribe labeled analysis tools and analysis activities as the enemy.
Great. A good question that, or rather, an interesting question that came in from Lubos Ilcik, I think. Hopefully, I get these names correct. And I'm putting this on your Skype chat window, David. The question is also related to the question that I had in my sort of advanced set of topics that we wanted to take up. So the question is, we use the Kanban board and the WIP as a prime means for managing our workflow. How can we use the CFD in addition to these prime means? And this is a question that has come up in general for how do we use Kanban metrics more effectively in decision making, and in particular the use of the CFD. And the background to that is that most people start to use the Kanban system. They start to track overall flow and have fairly reasonably complete or good data CFDs available to them in a short amount of time. How should they interpret the CFD, and what potential changes they might make to their Kanban design in order to improve the overall situation or overall flow?
So I started using CFDs in 2002 as an enhancement to replace the feature completion graphs that we were used to using in feature-driven development. And I made that switch because I read Don Reinertson's Managing the Design Factory. And I was busy writing my Agile Management for Software Engineering book at the time. I found CFDs to be incredibly useful on a day-to-day basis back in that era when we weren't using Kanban systems, when we had essentially what I've referred to as a managed WIP system rather than a limited WIP system. So in other words, I was using the CFD to keep a daily eye on the quantity of work in progress and to be able to make on-the-spot interventions with the team to show up at stand-up meetings. And it's become the famous quote now, but the there was a specific day in February 2004 where I walked into a stand-up meeting with the printout of the CFE and told the team that they had to stop starting things and start finishing things. And of course I reported that at a couple of conferences later that year. And that's become a core mantra of the community because it caught on. So the CFDs were very useful in that era of managed WIP prior to limited WIP. And it's come up several times in recent years that cumulative flow diagrams are less useful in a limited WIP world. And I think there is some truth to that they're less useful on a day-to-day basis because the information you need to manage day-to-day is on the board and it's visual and you can see it. However, I think the cumulative flow diagrams have an important role to play over a longer period of time. The throughput rate that's shown on the CFD is incredibly useful for long-term planning, and the CFDs are also very useful for reflecting on process changes. So they're useful at operations review meetings, and they're useful over time to reflect back on specific process and Kanban system design changes that may have been made over a period of months. So CFD is still very useful, but not so much on a day-to-day basis.
Right, right. A second question that had up on the slide here is related to the tracking of quality. A lot of customers are focused on quality in general and are tracking quality using metrics such as defect leakage and defect density. So in the context of the earlier discussion that we had about tracking rework and sort of detecting items that have escaped attention and are caught later, does Kanban potentially, or can Kanban potentially help in contributing to data to get these metrics, or should the tracking of these metrics continue outside of the Kanban system in general?
I haven't been asked this question before, so I'm looking at it, and my immediate reaction is that this falls in that category of you start with what you're doing now, and therefore the answer to this is clearly that it lies outside of the Kanban system. Might Kanban help? Well, defect leakage, escaped defect in production, we're only going to see that if it comes back as failure demand, as a production defect fix request. And defect density, well, are we measuring, for example, I think that it's probably best that you stick with the way that you're currently doing it.
Right, right. I think the sort of corollary question that we get asked is that in general, for improving overall quality of software, what are some of the things that we can do in Kanban, and is it primarily do we primarily focus on sort of smoothing the flow, and as long as flow is smooth, we have done the most from a quality perspective, or are there specific things that one could do to improve quality overall? And I guess that's again a very high-level question, so I'm not sure can be taken up in a short time like this.
Well, the chapter 3 of the existing book has the title "The Recipe for Success," and there's a long history how that title came about. But essentially, in that chapter, there are 6 bullet points, and the context of that guidance was the idea that you have been appointed as a new function line manager, a development manager, a testing manager, an analysis department manager. And what actions could you take unilaterally that would help to improve things and to establish some social capital, some trust for you that you might then use to enable further organization level changes. And that recipe was put together based on some guidance that I got from Don Rennertson and from Ellie Goldratt, and from some observations that Daniel Vicanti and I had from working together at Sprint and Motorola in the earlier part of the last decade. And number one on that list is focus on quality. And then I explain in the book a number of ways that Kanban can help focus on quality. Some very simple observations are that you can make the pull criteria very explicit, and those in some cases actually printed out on the board. And of course, Agile people refer to those as definition of done, and more traditional software development lifecycle people refer to them as exit criteria. But the Kanban board makes it very visual and explicit, the criteria required before something can move forward. Visualizing as different work item types, value versus failure demand, also helps to focus on quality. And generally, the visualization and the collaborative working that's encouraged with Kanban enables quality. But there's a much more thorough explanation in chapter 3 of the book.
Okay, great. Let me take one more question. We are coming up to the 90-minute mark, so I'm going to try and see if we can take a few additional audience questions. There is a question from Joy Spooner, and I've asked him a clarification as well. But the question is, he says that he's getting into Kanban in higher education, and I presume higher education here means he is in the education business or education sector. The question is a common problem that I run across is contrasting getting new work done while representing the disruptions from current operations. So I guess this is more towards a class of service type of design of system.
Yeah. So clearly, class of service and work item type are important here. In fact, the whole process that, to be honest, I didn't document well enough in the existing book, but the process that we teach in our classes, where we have people understand demand and understand capability and study things like internal and customer sources of dissatisfaction. Commonly in a situation like this, you'll hear people report, I constantly get interrupted with operations work. And while we might recognize that as a problem, we may not be in a position to fix it immediately. So stage one is to visualize it, to be able to design the Kanban board and recognize that there are different types of work here, and that there's a hidden class of service, that operations work is being given a higher class of service than perhaps longer running work, and to be able to collect that data and report on it so that we can raise awareness of the challenges. And then that might result in some redesign. Mike Burrows in Antwerp last week was talking about the idea that you might ring fence the interruptions. That's essentially encapsulating the variability, and you might do that by creating some specialist job function with new individuals, or you might ring fence it in some other way by saying that certain people on the staff will rotate through handling the disruptive operations work, essentially protecting the others from disruption. And that's an example of using specialization for a good purpose, for encapsulating variability, to improve the predictability of the system, and doing so generally improves customer satisfaction.
Right.
Improves our ability to service the demand. In general, I can't think of a specific example. I feel that we had someone in a class in Europe just in the last couple of weeks who was doing something very similar, applying Kanban in a higher education IT department. And of course, there is the very famous example of Fidelis in Brazil, where a company that makes software for managing universities and higher education institutions, but not specifically in the IT department.
So, is that the example that you talked that you're referring to from an education industry perspective?
They're clearly in the industry, but it's not addressing Joey's specific situation. It's talking about the IT department of a university,
right,
or college. And I know that we've had at least one class attendee recently who was doing something similar, but unfortunately I see a lot of people in classes and I don't remember all of them. However, the general problem of large amounts of disruptive work, which is often very urgent and operational in nature, is a common problem. And the key is to identify the work item types, to design appropriate classes of service, to think about how the Kanban system design should be implemented, so that the disruption is encapsulated and the system becomes a lot more predictable and customer satisfaction is improved.
Great. So with that, I think we have reached the 90-minute mark, and I'm going to. There are a number of other questions that are there, and including some that we had planned for on our own slides as well. But given the time constraint, I'm going to stop here. We will, as in the past, we will follow up with responses to the unanswered questions from the audience as well in our follow-up emails. I just wanted to share our contact information here for people who might be interested in reaching out to either us or to David. And David, again, once again, a very interesting discussion, very interesting session this morning. Thanks very much for your time and your answers. And to the whole audience here, again, thanks very much for the participation and for all the questions that you asked. We are continuously seeing an increase in the overall, effort by organizations to adopt Kanban aggressively in terms of improving their current way of working, whether it is Scrum, whether it is iterative, whether it is other methods, or whether they are replacing. Sometimes the question comes up is that we want to replace Scrum with Kanban, and we're dealing with a variety of situations, and certainly these sessions help in terms of answering some of the questions that come up from people who are solving real challenges in their own specific situations. So thank you very much for participating, and we look forward to hearing from you outside of the webinar as well. David, thanks very much again. Any closing remarks from your side?
Thank you once again for having me. I think it's a very useful forum, and maybe next time we can have some more questions from the audience and less questions from Digite, although I'm assuming that the questions that you had actually came from customers.
They're all genuine 100% customer questions, David. So
right, very good.
Absolutely, and hopefully, I think I see a number of them on the call today, so hopefully this has been very useful for them as well.
Yeah, so I think these are useful events, and I hope that we keep scheduling them regularly. It might be interesting if we could have some of my other team members on one of these, do more of a panel session type of thing.
Yes, I think that's a great point. We should, yes, we should plan for that in the next one. Excellent. Thank you, David, and you have a great rest of the day. And thank you all to the audience as well. Goodbye.